Okay, for our first talk today, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Katherine Connelly, and she's going to speak to us about Hackney's working class suffragettes.
Thank you so much to the organisers of this event for inviting me. It's a real privilege to come here and talk about some very, very special women indeed. The first London suffragettes to be arrested in the militant suffrage campaign were working class women from East London. Here they are. In the middle, you've got Adelaide Knight from Hackney Town, and just next to her, on your right, is Jane Scarborough from Bow. She was a needle worker, and they're standing there with Annie Kelly, who's one of the sort of more famous of the suffragettes. So what I'm talking about here is the militant suffrage campaign. So this was a campaign in which women used tactics of direct action and civil disobedience to campaign for the right to vote. And at the beginning, this campaign was initiated in Manchester in 1903 by the Pankhurst family. And here they are in their splendid hats. So you've got Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother, and then two of her daughters. There were three daughters, but two pictured here in the middle, her eldest daughter, Christabel Pankhurst, and then Sylvia Pankhurst, who I'm going to be talking mostly about today, her second daughter. The campaign was founded in Manchester, but quite soon they decided to move the kind of centre of the campaign to London, obviously the capital city, the centre of political power. And they decided to do that around 1905, 1906. And Sylvia Pankhurst is charged with initially setting up that campaign. She was in that period still at university. She was studying as an art student. Really, her vocation was to be an artist. And so in the first few months, it's Sylvia who's asked to combine with her art studies the project of establishing a national campaign, a militant campaign for votes for women. And Sylvia Pankhurst goes to East London to start that campaign. Now, it meant something different in this period to go to East London to start your campaign. It meant something different to organise amongst women there, and everybody knew it. Because it meant that you were organising with working class women, because of all of the kind of associations that had accumulated in the kind of imagination of the establishment around East London. It was, in the words of Jack London, the abyss. It was outcast London. This is how this place was imagined. It was regarded as somewhere dangerous, as somewhere foreign. But also, of course, to organise somewhere like East London meant that the kinds of women that you were getting involved, this is the kind of crucial part, brought their own experiences and their traditions of organising the labour and the socialist movements along with them. So I want to sort of explain the kind of thing that I mean when I say that, because the first women that Sylvia Pankhurst got involved in the campaign were working women from East London who were involved in a campaign over unemployment, demanding that the government provide some provision for people who find themselves unemployed. Where's the work? Why is the state not providing for people? Here's a photograph of some of these women. What they've done is they've come into central London from out east. They held a rally in Caxton Hall, and then they sent a deputation, this is the deputation, a women's deputation, to go and speak to the Prime Minister to talk about women's particular experiences of unemployment connected to how are we supposed to provide for our families. They went to see the Prime Minister, and that time Conservative Arthur Balfour, who, when they walked in the room, got out his air fresh bottle spray. Can you imagine? Just to kind of really intimidate them. But they refused to be intimidated, and these women were in a branch called the Unemployed Women of South West Ham. They became the first branch of the militant suffragettes in London. So later became the Canning Town branch of the Women's Social and Political Union. exactly the same individuals who begin to start connecting up the campaign over unemployment, the changes that they wanted to see, with the fact that women didn't have the right to vote. Now, this kind of a campaign, which very much influences the suffragettes. After this, the suffragettes do the same thing for years. They held women's parliaments in Caxton Ball, and then they would send deputations to Parliament, just like these unemployed women. This was something that Sylvia Pankhurst's older sister, Christabel, very much objected to. And particularly, she objected to the kinds of women that were being involved. She objected to East Londoners being involved. This is what Christabel wrote in her autobiography years later. She talks about the fact she came down to London to kind of take over the campaign. She did. And she said, "Surveying the London work as I found it, I considered that in one sense, it was too exclusively dependent for its demonstrations upon women of the East End. The East End women were used to turning out in numbers, for many of them had done so in connection with Labour demonstrations. It was, however, the right and duty of women more fortunately placed to do their share, and the larger share, in the fight for the vote." So what Christabel was arguing here was she didn't really want women bringing their kind of traditions of Labour activism into the campaign. And also what she was arguing was that wealthier women ought to kind of, it was their duty, as she put it, to kind of do these sort of acts of sacrifice on behalf of poorer women. So they could do it for them. These women were told to keep at the back of demonstrations, to not come to the front anymore. They were told this really wasn't their place. Now, this idea that some women could represent other women obviously had rather ominous implications if you're campaigning in a movement that seeks political rights. And indeed, it's around this time that the Women's Social and Political Union very much defines their campaign as votes for women, and this is how they put it, on the same terms as it is or may be granted to men. Now, at this time, 40% of men didn't have the right to vote. The poorest men in society were excluded by a property qualification, and that they had a certain amount of private property in order to have the right to vote. So what was being said here on the same terms was the campaign would be to campaign for the wealthier women in society to have the right to vote. And for other people, that's something that they have. That's up to Parliament. So it did become kind of a part of the objective of the campaign. Essentially, was a sidelining of these kinds of women. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst, as a socialist, was very unhappy with this kind of political direction of the campaign, and she decides later on to try and shift the politics of the Women's Social and Political Union. She does this at an absolutely kind of crucial moment in the campaign, around 1912. So in 1912, militancy has massively escalated, in particular in response to acts of state violence, repression on the streets by the police, but also the way in which women were being treated in the prisons, the forcible feeding, so on and so forth. Militancy has escalated. We're now talking about very substantial attacks on private property, the smashing of windows, even arson attacks starting to take place. We're seeing the very severe criminalization of the campaign, women facing now potentially years of imprisonment. And Sylvia Pankhurst was very concerned with this because she saw that along with the increasing criminalization of the campaign, it was becoming more and more elitist, and therefore relying upon fewer and fewer women. She thought that this was not only politically a mistake, but was also going to lead to the termination of that movement. It would not be able to sustain itself. What she wanted to do was to transform the women's suffrage movement into a mass movement, as she said, from which only a minority of people would stand aside from it. So she goes back to East London to start to try and organize the state of campaigning. She urges a militant campaign that doesn't do actions in secret, which of course RC had to be done in the middle of the night, things like this. She wanted it to be a very open campaign, and she wanted it to be a campaign where the masses would confront the kind of police violence that suffragettes were experiencing. In particular, some of you might know about the Cat and Mouse Act that was introduced in 1913, really as a way to undermine the suffragette hunger strikes, this idea that when a woman was hunger striking in prison, she could be released for a few days on license and then told to report back to the prison. The government thought this was a fantastic idea, but that's totally undermines the strike. What would be the point in it? Forgetting, of course, that no self-respecting suffragette is going to come back and return herself to prison. This is why it gets known as the Cat and Mouse Act, because, of course, you then have women on the run, like mice, from the police who turn into the cats, trying to kind of hunt them down. Sylvia Pankhurst wanted resistance to police attempts to rearrest the mice suffragettes by communities. And it's to this end that she establishes in East London what was called a People's Army, men and women fighting together to protect suffragettes on the run. And they drilled on the streets of London, and they drilled here in Hackney. They drilled in the Devonshire Hall, which is on what's now Bread House Road. Sorry, Bitbury. It used to be called Devonshire Road, so that was where they drilled, and it's also where they had political meetings as well. As you can see, there's a meeting they called there with some of the kind of key speakers of the day. Of course, Sylvia Pankhurst, but also George Lansbury as well. Had been the local Labour MP. So these were the kinds of changes that they wanted to make to the campaign. What they also wanted to do was this idea of kind of besieging Parliament. That's also what they wanted to return to the streets with mass demonstrations. So the idea that they would kind of storm Downing Street, they would storm Parliament and put so much pressure on the establishment to concede votes for women. This would be essentially a mass movement in action rather than kind of secretive and relying just on a few. Therefore, it has to galvanize the majority of people in society, and the majority of people, of course, were working class people. So like men are really galvanized in this campaign. Now, it's for this that Sylvia Pankhurst's groups in East London were expelled from the Women's Social and Political Union. They were expelled in 1940 by Christabel Pankhurst. And according to Sylvia, this is what her older sister said to her when she expelled them. A working women's movement was of no value. Working women were the weakest portion of the sex. How could it be otherwise? Their lives are too hard, their education too meager to equip them for the contest. Surely it is a mistake to use the weakest for the strong. We want picked women, the very strongest and most intelligent. So this was about plots. The exclusion of these women was absolutely about class and about the kind of ideas that somebody like Christabel Pankhurst held about working class women and their capacity to achieve change. So Sylvia Pankhurst didn't stop. She continued to organize her own organization. It was now called the East London Federation of Suffragettes, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. The difference between the two organizations was very starkly revealed only a few months after they get expelled, when in August 1914, the British government announces it's joining the First World War. The Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emily and Christabel Pankhurst, vociferously supports that war effort, becomes a virulently kind of patriotic, xenophobic organization that really suspends its militant struggle for the vote for the duration of the war in order to support that war effort. Sylvia Pankhurst's organization, the East London Federation of Suffragettes, campaigns against the war and exposes the disproportionate costs that this war placed on the shoulders of working women in particular. Now, this campaign, when people talk about the East London Federation of Suffragettes, mostly they are thinking about Bow and Poplar. And there's good reasons for this. This is where the biggest branches of the organization were. And Sylvia Pankhurst herself lived in Bow. She moved to the Old Board Road. And she established the first headquarters on the Bow Road. There she is doing that, speaking outside the rooms that they've newly acquired. And Poplar, of course, was a centre of militant labour organisations around the docks. And so, very often this is where they started their demonstrations. They recruited dockers' wives and gained the support of many of the trade unionists who worked on the docks. Obviously, today I'm going to be talking about what we do in Hackney, and I really want to thank you for this opportunity to think through what it meant, what the campaign meant in Hackney, and how that was distinctive, to talk about a lesser known group of these working class militant suffragettes, to talk about the ideas and experiences that they brought into the movement. And what I want to kind of stress is that this is in no way a kind of parochial story. That's a story that is going to connect very much to international politics, lived out here on the streets of Hackney. So what I want to kind of start off by saying and emphasising really is that Hackney's obviously one of the first places that Sylvia Pankhurst turned to when she wants to transform the suffragette movement. In the summer of 1912, just when she's starting to try and change things, this is when, in the suffragette press, we start to see mentions of a woman we know as Mrs. E. Ives. And so Mrs. Ives is called the honorary secretary of the Brudge in Hackney. And she starts to invite people to her home, which was actually in South Tottenham, but she was organising here in Hackney from the summer of 1912. One of the first things suffragettes like to do when they establish themselves in an area was they like to open a committee room. So it's make it visible, try and open it sort of on a high street. And it was somewhere where you come and get your kind of suffragette literature, your leaflets, your newspapers, but you could also hold meetings there as well. And this is what they did in Hackney. In the summer of 1913, they opened committee rooms at 175 Dalston Lane. This is what it looked like. I want to thank Hackney Archives of the lovely CLR James Library for giving me the mission to show this here today. This is standing outside. This is taken probably around 1912. It's thought is the daughter of the owner of the newsagents. So this is Edith Parker, because Dad owned this newsagent. The newsagents stopped the suffragettes' newspapers and literature, and probably the committee rooms were upstairs. Now, when we think about Bow and Poplar, most of the suffragette sites have gone. They've been bought. But I'm happy to say 75 Dalston Lane is still there. And you can see it's still a newsagent, which is lovely, and still looks kind of similar. So it's there. It's there as a kind of living legacy of where they organised. When Sylvia Pankhurst and the East London suffragettes were expelled, Mrs. Ives and 175 Dalston Lane going with the East London suffragettes. So this remains their headquarters, place where they continue to organise. So 175 remained a centre for the suffragettes in Hackney. And so that we had many speakers from the campaign coming to that place and talking politics. And the last mention that I found of 175 Dalston Lane was at the beginning of 1916, where this woman, Patricia Lynch, again, local suffragette, came to speak. And just a couple of months later, she goes to Dublin right after the Easter Rising, this revolt against British rule during the First World War. And she produced one of the only sympathetic first-hand accounts to publish this at incredible writs. And, she could have been prosecuted by the military authorities for doing this, but she reported on this uprising that almost everybody in Britain, including most sections of the left, were kind of disparaging of it. It was an uprising, it was very brutally crushed, and she sided with it and risked her life to get that news out there. So she's one of the people speaking at 175. Okay, and I want to speak a little bit about Mrs. Ives. And so she again was a long-standing activist. But sadly, we know almost nothing about her. We know at the moment, it's very much a work in progress. We know the first initial of her name, which was E. We know that she was married, and we know that she was physically very courageous. Sylvia Pankhurst described her as a very small, delicate woman. And in 1913, she went to a meeting that was addressed by Sylvia Pankhurst. Sylvia Pankhurst was wanted by the police under the Cat and Mouse Act. She gets up to speak, and the police storm the hall. The suffragettes pick up chairs. They're fighting the police, trying to stop them from coming in. And a lot of the people in the hall were very badly beaten, including Mrs. Ives. Very small, delicate Mrs. Ives apparently was seized by her coat collar by the police and beaten with a truncheon until her collarbone was broken. Horrendous, and an absolute catastrophe, of course, for a working class person to suffer that kind of injury. One of probably one of the most successful things that the East London suffragettes achieved was a deputation in June of 1940, when they go to see the Prime Minister. And again, this recalls the kind of activism of those 1905 women in the unemployment campaign, sending working class women to talk about their experiences to the Prime Minister. Oh, now, there's a famous photograph of the 6 women who were sent. Sylvia Pankhurst didn't go. She wanted working class women to be speaking for themselves. So these are 6 working women from East London who were elected at mass meetings, so they represent more than themselves. They were there to represent their communities. So here they are. Now, this deputation was achieved by Sylvia Pankhurst when she was released from prison, one of these hunger strikes, under the Cat and Mouse Act. She refused to stop that hunger strike. In fact, she'd gone further. It wasn't just a hunger strike. It was also a thirst strike, so she was refusing to drink any water. And she was refusing to rest as well. So very, very dangerous. And when she's released from prison, she decides she's not going to stop doing that. She asked to be driven to the Houses of Parliament, where she was too weak to kind of sit up at this point. So she lies down on the steps of Parliament and demands that the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, now a Liberal Prime Minister, receives a deputation of working women. And he backs down. Says, yes, I'll see these women. And one of the things is that we need to ask why she had to go to those kind of lengths in order to achieve this deputation. In 1905, the Conservative Prime Minister, he's met the most insulting kind of way, where you didn't need to be working with you. At this point, the Prime Minister was refusing to meet any members of the suffragette campaign. And we know this because actually a group of East Londoners had gone to try to meet with him a few weeks before. And among them was Mrs. Ives. She wasn't on the final deputation, but she had attempted to go. And they wrote them a letter when he refused to see them. And this is what they wrote. "You have never received a deputation of working women on this question. Therefore, until you know the why and wherefore of their demands, you are unable to judge the right or wrong of what they are demanding." It's a very combative letter for working women in East London to write to the Prime Minister. And the first signature on the letter was Mrs. Ives' signature, which kind of gives an indication of how much she represented in this campaign. So Mrs. Ives was active in the campaign at least until 1915. So she was involved in anti-war campaigning as well. She was remembered by Sylvia Pankhurst as the Hackney secretary, and we know that she was at the beginning. But actually, when they become the East London Federation of Suffragettes, Mrs. Ives is organising in Bow. And the Hackney secretary of the East London Suffragettes was a woman called Miss Young, who lived at number 100 Greenwood Road. And this is her on the census of 1911. The house, again, is still there. As we'll see from the very large Young family, there are a number of Miss Youngs. I'm assuming that it's the eldest daughter, Annie Winifred Young, and for a number of reasons. She was the eldest daughter of the family, and 25 in 1911. And we can tell from the census she describes herself as an artist, a magic lantern maker, and everybody else in the family used to work at the post office. And we know from watching Lights on the newspaper, so I'm free most of the week, just not Friday evenings and Saturday evenings, which is probably not, she had a great social life, I don't know, but maybe it's because she's doing the magic lanterns at those ties. It would explain why she's got a bit more free time if she's not working for the post office. And possibly they were a family with liberal sympathies, and at least initially, one of their children is named after Gladstone, I think, William Ewart, up there. And maybe their opinions changed about that. And we know again that this Greenwood's this Yarmouth Greenwood Road was active until about 1915 as well. Now, a lot of the strength of the Hackney organisation came from the kind of contacts that suffragettes here had with local Labour and Socialist organisations. And I'm drawing here very much from work that's been produced before by Ken Weller, by Barbara Winslow, by Karen Hunt, people like that. And we've pointed out the connections between a militant men's organisation to campaign for votes for women, the men's political union, and also a group called the Herald League. So they were socialists organising locally. And around 1960, they recruited this woman, Emma Boyce. And she's probably the most famous of all of the Hackney members. Now, she lived for a while on de Beauvoir Square. And I've put a photograph of one of the houses that she lived in. It looks pretty nice and pretty big, nice fancy house. But we know from a different address she lived on de Beauvoir Square. She sort of moved around a lot, as many of these women did. This is number 3 where she lived. In 1901, again, when the census is done, she was living at number 44. We know from that census return there were 7 different families living in number 44. So probably a lot of people living in these quite big houses, so probably quite overcrowded. Now, she was from an older generation. It's said in the books and on Wikipedia that she's born in 1867. I think that's not quite right. I think she's born 10 years earlier in 1857. So she was around 60 when she joined. Now, she was a very experienced socialist activist. And she had been a member of the Social Democratic Federation, which was a Marxist organization in Britain. And in that capacity, she toured the whole country. It's kind of how she made her living a lot of the time. She toured everywhere, Plymouth to Aberdeen, and a touring speaker. And she was really interested in women's issues, particularly thought about socialism in relation to women and children. But she didn't like the suffragettes. In fact, in the summer of 1912, at a conference of her organisation, she changed its name, to the British Socialist Party, she actually argued against a resolution that said the British Socialist Party should be expressing sympathy with the suffragettes. Why? Well, we know that she is very much connected to the international socialist movement, and she was drawing her ideas from very influential socialist women like Clara Zetkin, like Alexandra Kollontai in Russia, I'm going to quote to you though from Boyce's own words on this. This is what she said in 1909. Votes should not be given to thousands of women who lived on the working class without it being given to all working women. So essentially what she's saying is, I'm not going to campaign for votes for women on the same terms as it is, or maybe working women later. And I think this is quite interesting because at the same time as we know that she was somebody who, in her activism as a socialist, thought that it was important that women's specific concerns were recognised and agitated around, was also somebody who said richer women can't represent working women, and working women should be fighting for their own rights. So she's very much influenced by that kind of thinking. And so her joining the East London suffragettes shows how much the East London suffragettes had kind of changed in this period. When she joins in 1916, they'd also changed their name to the Workers' Suffrage Federation. So they are now campaigning for what they described as human suffrage, votes for everybody. Now, most of the information that I've discovered about Mrs. Boyce comes from an absolutely extraordinary document that she wrote in 1909. And this was a letter, note the letter that she published in the press to a very famous doctor, a man called Sir Victor Horsley. Now, Victor Horsley was became very famous as an ally of suffragette movement. He spoke out against forcible feeding. So very important to have a doctor say this is dangerous. So here's Victor Horsley alongside Emma Boyce, who challenges him. She wasn't challenging him over his comments on forcible feeding, but on alcoholism. And he'd written that alcoholism was responsible for poor children being undersized. And Mrs. Boyce takes some grace to objectivist, and she refers to her own experience. She said that she was teetotal, and she talked about the first 5 children that she had, who all died due to being overworked. She said in the period when she was pregnant and just after birth, she was having to work farting hard, and all of them died. So, well, that's nothing to do with alcoholism. And then she said later on, when she was in better circumstances, she had 2 more children who were born strong and healthy. She's still teetotal. And then when she was, again, went through hard times, she had 2 more children. And she said they don't look like members of the same family. And so she concluded that poverty and overwork, not alcoholism, was the curse of working class people. The implication there that social change was needed, not moralizing at the poor. This is the way she said. The only remedy is socialization of the means of production. So for working people to be in charge of work. It would then be impossible for one woman to go to a ball or a reception in a dress worth £500 while her poor sister goes through the pangs of childbirth on a sack of straw. This terrible thing happened in Haggerston last year. Her argument absolutely grounded in local experiences in Hackney. But then she goes on to talk about his family. And she says, what about your brother Gerald, who was puny when he was a boy? And what about your 2 sisters, who were not particularly robust? And how come Sir Victor, she calls him, you're the only one who's over average height in your family? How did she know this? Well, the letter begins like this. Dear Sir, it is many years since I had the pleasure of living in the same house with you as one of your father's servants. She went on to say she'd always liked him best because she thought he was the most democratic member of the family and, quote, almost as good as a socialist. And she remembered him bringing home a working class man as a friend, and his family being completely shocked at him defending his. She again quoted him. He said, he's a decent chap, that's all I care about. And this very much impressed her, as she said that she followed his career ever since. And so she was really disappointed that he'd now come out with statements like this. Now, of course, he actually replied to this letter in the press. It didn't, he sort of studiously avoided any reference to his own family or the fact that she'd be a servant in his house. What I want to stress, though, is how extraordinary this document is. We usually talk about divisions in the suffragette movement over questions of social class, sometimes in quite abstract terms. This is a very intimate interaction that would never normally have been broadcast. Servants aren't supposed to write these things about the people whose houses they live in. We always never get this kind of an account, and yet this is a disagreement expressed by 2 people who become very significant in the suffragette movement. It's not a debate over the suffragette movement, but it is a debate over questions of social class that she initiates on the basis of this kind of experience. And also when we talk about working class women in the suffragette movement, and we talk about that kind of the conflicts in which they were involved in, necessarily we're mostly talking about women who were working in factories, because this is where it was kind of easier to express these kind of conflicts. Very difficult for kind of obvious reasons for servants to be engaged in this kind of in class struggle in the same way. But actually, if you think about London in this period, most working women worked as domestic servants, but of course they're in their employer's house, or all of those kind of things. So this is an absolutely extraordinary testament to the fact that there were these kind of class feelings that usually, would have gone unexpressed, except Mrs. Boyce was bold enough to express them. What it also does for us is it provides some biography for her. And this is partly where I think where the date that's given for her birth is raw, and how I sort of discovered that. Her socialist friends, who knew Elsie well, said when she died in 1929, she was 72 years old. And if we take this and the details that she gives us in the letter, then we can find Emma Boyce on the census. And so here she is in 1911, living at 216 Dalston Lane. And now in 1911, they asked new questions of people when they filled out the census, partly because the Liberal government was introducing social reforms. And for the first time, they asked people not only how many children they had living with them, but how many children were born to the mother and how many had survived. And as you can see here, she's written that she had 10 children, of whom 6 died and 4 survived, the 4 that she refers to. The 2 healthier ones, the older ones, were Henry, who was moved out by then, and Ellen, who was called Nellie, and then the 2 younger ones, George and Albert. She's the head of the household, as she was in 1901, and it may be that her husband has deserted her because there's no mention of him in those censuses and Jennings Spread boys. It's not until 1921 that she describes herself as a widow. She describes herself as married, but we can't see her husband here, and she married in 1880. So she's probably a single parent doing all of this activism with her children. We know from her marriage certificate that she was born Emma Wood, and we can find her here on the 1871 census, again working as a domestic servant, not in Borsley's household, but here in a household in Tottenham when she's just 15 years old. So we'll think about those kind of experiences and how they might have informed her ideas. These experiences, in other words, provide insight into her commitment to socialism and to fighting for the rights of women and children. And she continued her energetic touring as a member of the Workers' Suffrage Federation. There's oral testimony of her being thrown off a platform in 1918 when she's speaking against the war as quite an older woman when she's speaking in Reading. And she said she went to Labour Party conference in 1927. She described herself as somebody who'd been spouting at street corners for 25 years. She went on to be elected as a Hackney councillor for Labour in 1980 and was, until her death, a governor from the London Maternity Hospital, again combining these interests, Hackney, women and children. The East London Federation suffragettes transformed the suffragette movement, in part because it started in East London. Women there brought their experiences from their lives, the political conclusions they'd drawn, and contributed this to a more radical, democratic vision of suffrage politics. They involved street politics, they stood up to and experienced police violence, they were elected by their peers as spokeswomen for their communities, and they even challenged the Prime Minister. They didn't get everything they wanted, which was a world without poverty and a world without war, but I think actually it's for that reason that they remain all the more relevant and inspirational for us to.
We've got 10 minutes for questions.
I wondered if you could say something about their involvement in campaign to support Ethiopia and Haile Selassie against the invasion of the fascists. Because I think her internationalism is another really important dimension that distinguishes her from the other people in their family who are not internationalists and not at it war, whereas she was.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a great question. Really important part of Sylvia's life. It comes from her anti-fascism. She was one of the first people in this country to be raising the alarm about the dangers of the rise of fascism. Obviously a very pertinent topic for us today. And partly she knew about this because she was connected to all the kind of international communist debate. She'd been to Italy. Her partner, Silvio Corio, was an Italian anarchist. And so she was raising the alarm about Benito Mussolini. At a time where Winston Churchill was saying, if he'd been Italian, he would definitely have voted for him. And she would say this was an existential threat to everything that she held dearly, all right, because she was an internationalist. She saw this as a threat to democracy, to women's rights, to workers' rights, everything. In 1935, fascist Italy invades the African country of Ethiopia with really the appeasement of the British and the French. And so she dedicated the rest of her life to campaigning for Ethiopian freedom. And she got press reports down there about fascist atrocities. And she moved out to Ethiopia, and she refused to go there when it was a country under occupation, or under the threat of British occupation, as it was at the end of the Second World War. But she moved out there at the invitation of Emperor Haile Selassie and dedicated the last 4 years of her life to trying to rebuild the country. So you're right, it's a incredible testament to her politics.
Forgive me, my question is actually about the May from a bit with suffragette movement. It's always presented to us as votes for women. But what's the objective? Votes for women or votes for some?
Yeah, I think this goes to the heart of it on the same terms as it is or may be granted to men. Now, they were campaigning, therefore, the object of the campaign was for more privileged women, for women with property. And if Parliament conceded that, more people were going to be included, then fine, but it did make up the object of the campaign. Now, partly they didn't do this because there had been a history of suffrage bills being introduced for men and into Parliament, and a women's amendment being proposed and just voted down. And so they said, well, we're not going to play that game anymore. We are demanding votes for women. So the thing is, there was a kind of inbuilt divide and rule in Parliament over this question. But for working class women, there was this, of course, this question about, well, are we even included in this? What the East London Federation of Suffragettes end up doing is they essentially say they campaign for votes for all women. They make a principled demand of Parliament, and it's up for Parliament to work that out. But yes, I think the other campaign, it was elitist in tone, and they were campaigning for propertied women, and they didn't want working women involved in the campaign, which is very ominous of, how on earth were you going to achieve enfranchisement if they weren't really allowed to be at the forefront of that movement.
Thank you, Kate, for an absolutely brilliant talk. That was so fascinating. My question was just about what we can learn from the suffragettes today, and in particular the East London suffragettes. I mean, a lot of the movements today, sections of the climate movement or sections of the Palestine movement, Palestine Action and stuff, they take from the militant suffragettes or so-called militant suffragettes, tactics of property destruction or, direct action type tactics. But I wonder what we can learn from the kind of East London suffragettes tactics around mass movement organizing and stuff. Should we? And, we've heard the suffragettes in parliaments for MPs talking about the suffragettes, and but they kind of remember that history of they got the vote, but they don't remember the kind of tactics that they engaged in as a way to justify. And so it's a complicated question because, we want to defend people who are organizing today. But what else do we take in terms of that history from the kind of way Sylvia Pankhurst?
Thank you. I think this is a really, really important question because you're right. Lots of people do take inspiration from the suffragettes, and rightly, they had, incredibly courageous women, and I don't want to downplay that at all. But I think Sylvia Pankhurst had a really good answer to this, and it appears, I think most sharply in an unpublished piece of writing. You can view it online. It was called The Women's Movement of Today and Tomorrow. And she had a test, really, for militant action. She was very inspired by militancy. But her test was this: is it bringing more people on board or not? She thought that the most progressive types of change came from involving the largest amounts of people. It forces your movement to be democratic because you have to engage people where they are. And also it means that the majority of people are then, or large numbers of people are involved in claiming and fighting for their own liberations, very much not other people doing it on your behalf. So her question was always this: is this alienating people or is this inspiring people? And she thought what she called open militancy, and people could see the big demonstrations, even window smashing actually, to some extent. And as something that people saw and admired. They thought that the suffragettes were sacrificing something by going to prison, and they thought they're brave. The arson attacks done in the middle of the night with women trying to get away, she said this is very brave, which said the public don't understand that this is brave. This looks actually like cowardice. All they see is something burnt down. They don't understand why. It's not being tested democratically. It's not somebody getting up in a mass meeting and saying, shall we do this? It's done by one or two people, and then they flee in the middle of the night. And this is alienating people. And it's losing our cause support. And she thought, well, if we win something, what kind of a thing are we going to win? It'll be something very, very narrative. And it won't represent most people. And so I think that's a kind of crucial question for us today. Is this bringing more people on board? And of course, what she really thought about was, what's the kind of militancy working class people could partake in? Lots of working people couldn't go to prison. What is really militant? What's really going to destabilize the government? And she was looking to ways in which the country could be brought to a standstill. The same period as the height of suffragette militancy was the height of Labour militancy in this country. Not Labour as in Labour Party, but as in working people in trade unions or in workplaces. But were going on strike in what's today called the Great Unrest, started from 1910 to 1914. And they were working people who'd been dismissed as unskilled, unorganised, they were bringing the country to a standstill by going on strike. And it was over a cost of living crisis. They were demanding better wages, and they were achieving change. And they could only do that collectively, in big numbers, by standing together. And everybody noticed, because all of a sudden, the coal's not being delivered, the trades aren't running. And she was saying, we need to utilise that kind of power. These actually are far from being the weakest and the stupidest and all of the horrible things that Sylvia Pankhurst said about working women. Actually, when they combine together, they're part of the strongest force in society, because they're the people that keep everything running. They're cleaning everybody's oils. They're making everything in the factories. So if you can persuade those women to collectively unite together, then we can achieve real, genuine, progressive change. And those women are going to be at the heart of achieving and seizing that liberation for themselves. And I think that's a really important message for them.
I understand Sylvia spent some time touring America. Why did a militancy movement come up in the UK but not from the US?
A really good question. I'm so glad you asked about America. And it's in the cheek up, but I do have a book over there, which is it's publishing soon. It's Sylvia's manuscript from her tours of America. She wrote very interestingly about gender in America, but also about class and about race and many other issues besides. I think it's a very interesting question, why the lack of militancy in the United States? Partly, I think, in a way, because some gains had been made. And so women in Wyoming won the right to vote quite early. It was partly being done on a state-by-state basis. So they were kind of holding referendums in different states. But so there was kind of the possibility of achieving this change. Militancy in Britain comes out of a certain frustration, but nothing's been achieved. And so that wasn't the case in the US. But having said that, there were women who were drawing inspiration from the British movement. Initially, Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was famous daughter of a famous campaigner, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she was kind of inspired by making some connections with the Labour movement a little bit. What I think is really interesting is when militancy does arrive in the US, which is in the First World War. So whereas in Britain, the Women's Social and Political Union suspend their militancy during World War I, in America, that's when it starts. And they had women who, and some of whom had been involved in the British campaign, who stood outside the White House and were really trying to expose the sort of hypocrisy of a war that was proclaimed to be in the interests of small nations and self-determination. And they were saying, well, what about self-determination for women in the United States? And they get arrested for doing this, and they adopt very similar tactics. So they adopt the hunger strike and things like that when they're in prison. Some of them actually are sent to workhouses and all sorts of things. So there is a little bit, but interestingly, it's in the war. And that's because, the American state is very much kind of cracking down on that and wanted a kind of patriotic united front in the time of war, and the suffragettes in America sort of split from that.
Just a big round of applause, please.